The call light from room 237 blinked red on my monitor at 2:14 a.m. I stared at it for a moment, then checked the patient roster. Empty. The room had been vacant for 3 days, scheduled for deep cleaning tomorrow morning. I clicked the light off and returned to my medication rounds. 7 years of ICU night shifts had taught me that hospital electronics glitched constantly, probably just faulty wiring. The familiar sounds of the ICU surrounded me. Ventilators breathing for patients who couldn't, heart monitors beeping their electronic lullabies, the distant hum of machines keeping people tethered to life. The antiseptic smell hung heavy in recycled air, mixed with something else tonight. Something organic and faintly sweet, like flowers beginning to wilt. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows between patient rooms. I'd grown accustomed to how this place looked at night. Sterile corridors stretching into darkness, the soft blue glow of monitors visible through doorways. But tonight felt different, quieter. The silence pressed against my eardrums like cotton. The light blinked on again. I pulled up the maintenance log. No reported issues with room 237's call system. The red dot pulsed insistently, demanding attention I couldn't give to an empty room. I had 12 actual patients to monitor. Mrs. Patterson recovering from cardiac surgery, Mr. Kim fighting pneumonia, elderly Mr. Valdez whose family had finally gone home after days of waiting. But that light kept blinking, persistent as a heartbeat. I grabbed my master keys and headed down the corridor. My white sneakers squeaked against polished linoleum, the overhead lights humming their electrical song. The shadows seemed deeper tonight, pooling between doorways like dark water. Room 237's door was closed. Odd for an empty room. The metal nameplate had been removed, leaving only faint adhesive residue. I knocked twice. A voice came from inside, weak, male. He said he needed help. My training kicked in. Patient safety first, regardless of what the computer said. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room appeared empty. Bed made with fresh linens, but rumpled as if recently occupied. The call button dangled within easy reach. An IV pole stood nearby, positioned with careful precision. The bedside table held a water pitcher, half full, with fresh condensation beating on the plastic. I called out, identifying myself as Jennifer, his night nurse. The voice responded from near the bed, clear but distant, like someone speaking through thick glass. He said he thought so. That he'd been sleeping so much lately, having the strangest dreams about his garden, about his wife, Margaret. Then he asked me something that made my skin crawl. He kept forgetting, he said. Was he supposed to be alive? My skin prickled. The room was noticeably cooler than the corridor. I'd heard confused patients ask strange things before. Post-surgical delirium, medication side effects. But this felt fundamentally different. Wrong. I moved closer, checking behind the privacy curtain, peering into the bathroom. The shower was bone dry, towels folded precisely. But the mirror above the sink was fogged with moisture. I touched the glass. Ice cold. I asked where exactly he was. He said he was right there in bed, of course. Robert Henley, room 237. The doctors had warned him he'd keep forgetting things. The dementia, you know. But he'd been talking to some of the other patients, and they seemed so worried about whether they were breathing correctly, whether their hearts were beating properly. Such unnecessary anxiety. He'd been trying to help them understand they didn't need to monitor those things so carefully. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my training ran deeper than fear. If someone was in distress, I had a professional obligation to help. Something was very wrong in room 237. At the nurse's station, I pulled up the electronic records for room 237, fingers trembling as I navigated the database. The screen flickered twice, then stabilized. Robert Henley, age 67. Admitted 2 weeks ago with complications from early onset dementia. The progression had been devastating. A brilliant man, a retired psychology professor, reduced to increasing confusion about basic existence. His wife, Margaret, had maintained vigil at his bedside until the end. Status: deceased. Date of death: 3 days ago at 11:47 p.m. Cause: respiratory failure secondary to pneumonia. My hands went cold. Body released to family for burial. Room scheduled for terminal cleaning. The nursing notes painted a disturbing picture. Increasing confusion about whether he was alive or dead, frequent questions about vital signs, an unusual fixation on counseling other patients about what he called their existential anxiety. He'd spent his final conscious hours trying to help patients stop worrying about breathing, about heartbeats, about the exhausting business of monitoring their own aliveness. The call light from 237 blinked on again. I stared at the death certificate, medical training warring with impossible evidence. But I'd heard him clearly, seen fresh signs of occupancy. Despite every logical protest, I had to go back. This time, Robert's voice was stronger, more conversational. I stood in the doorway, not quite ready to enter. The room felt occupied in a way that made the air hold its breath. He sounded genuinely pleased that I'd returned. He'd been thinking about what we discussed, and he believed he could help more patients here. They were so anxious about their vital functions, constantly monitoring their breathing, checking their pulse, worrying about whether their hearts were beating properly. It was exhausting for them, all that vigilance about staying alive. The temperature had dropped further. I could see my breath misting, and that sweet smell had grown stronger. Not quite flowers, not quite decay. Something caught between life and death. I asked if he remembered what happened to him. The last few days, he'd been sleeping mostly, having vivid dreams about his garden. He grew beautiful tomatoes, you know. Margaret always said he had magic hands with plants, and he'd been dreaming about teaching, about his students. He specialized in consciousness studies, the nature of awareness and identity. But he felt much clearer now than before, less confused. He wanted to share that clarity with other patients. My throat felt tight. I asked what kind of clarity. The understanding that they didn't need to work so hard at being alive. All that monitoring, all that anxiety about biological functions. It was such a burden. He'd learned that it was perfectly acceptable to stop keeping track of whether you're breathing, whether your heart is beating, whether you're truly alive at all. Much more peaceful that way. The words sent ice through my veins. I backed toward the door, but couldn't leave. Something in his tone made this more terrifying than malevolence. Genuine compassion, a desire to help. He wasn't trying to harm anyone. He was trying to help in the only way his confused, deceased mind understood. I said I needed to check on other patients. Yes, he agreed. Please do. They needed someone to explain it properly. Tell them it's perfectly fine to let go of monitoring their vital signs. Tell them they don't have to work so hard at being alive. I ran to room 235, heart hammering. Mrs. Patterson was awake, staring at the ceiling with wide, unfocused eyes. She'd been admitted for routine cardiac surgery, recovering beautifully, scheduled to go home tomorrow. When I asked how she was feeling, she turned slowly, as if movement required conscious effort. She had a question that had been troubling her. Was she supposed to be breathing? She kept thinking about it, focusing on each breath, and she wasn't sure if she was doing it correctly, or if she needed to do it at all. My blood turned to ice. Mrs. Patterson had been stable for days, chatting with her daughter, eager to go home. Now she lay perfectly still, chest rising and falling mechanically, as if she'd forgotten how to breathe naturally and was forcing each breath through willpower. I told her, of course, she needed to breathe. Her body knew what to do automatically, but the gentleman who visited had explained that it was perfectly acceptable to stop monitoring these things. He was very kind, very understanding. He said he'd been confused about breathing and heartbeats too, but now he understood it wasn't necessary to keep track. Her eyes looked through me rather than at me. He said she could stop worrying about whether she was alive or not. The infection was spreading, and I was running out of time. I checked her chart quickly, hands shaking. All vital signs normal, no medical reason for this sudden confusion. But something fundamental had shifted. Some basic connection to her own aliveness had been severed. Room 239. Mr. Kim sat upright, looking deeply troubled. He'd been recovering from pneumonia, nearly ready for discharge. He had a question about his heart. Was it supposed to be beating? He kept checking his pulse, but he couldn't remember what he was feeling for anymore. And his breathing. Was that something he needed to do consciously or automatically? He was getting confused about which functions were voluntary. Both patients had been stable and coherent during my earlier rounds. Now they questioned the most fundamental aspects of being alive, their eyes holding the same distant confusion I'd heard in Robert's voice. I moved through the ICU, dread growing with each room. The pattern was spreading. Mr. Valdez asked whether sleeping and waking were things he needed to monitor. The young woman recovering from a car accident wondered if she should keep track of her heartbeat, or just let it stop. Each spoke with the same calm confusion, the same peaceful acceptance of uncertainty about their own aliveness. Marcus, the other night nurse, moved through his rounds mechanically, but when I tried to discuss the patient's symptoms, he stared for several long seconds, as if he'd forgotten how conversation worked. He wasn't sure that was something we needed to worry about. One of the patients had mentioned that we don't have to monitor whether we're working or not. It made sense when you think about it. Why exhaust ourselves keeping track of every little thing? The respiratory therapist wandered the halls with a vacant expression, checking ventilators but seeming confused about their purpose. When I asked about the patient's breathing concerns, she looked puzzled. Breathing? She wasn't sure that was something we needed to focus on anymore. Someone had explained that it was better not to worry about those biological functions, less stressful that way. Robert's influence was spreading through the ICU like a slow-moving plague of forgetfulness, and I was running out of time. Soon I might lose track of what it meant to be alive, to be conscious, to maintain vigilant awareness. Already I found myself questioning basic things. When had I last eaten? Was my heart beating fast because I was afraid? Or was I afraid because I couldn't remember if my heart was supposed to be beating? I forced myself to focus, to remember fundamental facts. I was Jennifer Walsh. I was 31 years old. I was alive, breathing, heart beating, blood circulating, neurons firing. I had worked here for 7 years, ever since my divorce, throwing myself into night shifts to avoid going home to an empty apartment where silence reminded me of everything I'd lost. But even as I repeated these facts, they became less solid, less certain. The edges of my identity were blurring, my connection to aliveness growing tenuous. Maybe that's why Robert's confusion affected me so powerfully. I was already halfway to forgetting what it meant to be truly alive. The realization hit like a physical blow. My emotional detachment, my professional distance, my careful avoidance of genuine connection. It wasn't protection from pain. It was a kind of death itself, a gradual disconnection from the messy, complicated, beautiful business of being fully alive. For years, I'd been going through the motions without truly inhabiting my existence. I administered medications without really seeing the people who needed them, documented symptoms without considering the human beings experiencing them, maintained professional relationships without allowing genuine connection. I'd become so skilled at emotional detachment that I'd forgotten how to feel truly, completely alive. Robert's condition had mirrored my own emotional state. Confused about what it meant to be genuinely alive, going through motions without full engagement. That's why his death had created this supernatural effect spreading confusion about vital status, and why I was so vulnerable to his influence. I had to help him remember what it felt like to be alive, not just breathing and existing, but fully, consciously, joyfully alive. And in doing so, maybe I could remember it myself. I knew what I had to do. In room 237, I sat in the visitor's chair and spoke to the empty space where Robert's presence felt strongest. The air was cold enough that each exhale created visible clouds, and the smell of wilting flowers had grown overwhelming. I told Robert I wanted to talk to him about being alive, not about medical procedures or vital signs, but about what it actually felt like to be truly, completely alive. Silence stretched. Then he said he wasn't sure he remembered anymore. It had been so confusing. I asked him to try to remember. What did he love most? What made him feel most connected to being alive? The silence stretched longer, and I could sense him searching through memories that dementia had fragmented and death had made distant. His garden, he said finally, voice softer, more human. He grew incredible tomatoes behind their house. The smell of rich, dark soil in the morning, full of earthworms and possibility. The way plants felt when he touched their leaves. That fuzzy texture, so alive and warm. And Margaret's laugh. Oh, his wife had this laugh that started low in her chest and bubbled up like champagne. When she really found something funny, she'd laugh until tears ran down her cheeks, and he'd feel like his heart was going to burst with pure joy watching her face light up. I asked if he could feel those things now. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear him trying to access those sensations, reaching for feelings no longer available. No, he said, voice carrying surprise, dawning understanding. He could remember them perfectly, like looking at photographs, but he couldn't feel them anymore. The soil under his hands, Margaret's laughter filling the kitchen, the way his heart used to race when she smiled. It was all just memory now, like watching a movie of someone else's life. I told him that was because he wasn't alive anymore. Those feelings, those physical sensations, that connection to the world. They belonged to the living. He was trying to hold on to something that wasn't his to keep. I felt his presence waver like a fading radio signal. The temperature fluctuated wildly. Warm, then cold, then warm again, as if reality itself was struggling to stabilize. But the other patients, he said, voice becoming fainter. They were so worried about breathing, about their hearts beating, about staying alive. He wanted to help them stop worrying. He thought if they could just let go of monitoring those things constantly, they'd be more peaceful, less anxious. I leaned forward, speaking not just to Robert but to myself, to the part that had been sleepwalking through existence for years. They needed to worry about those things. That's what kept them alive. That's what made them human. The worry, the awareness, the constant monitoring of our own existence. That wasn't a burden to escape. It was what made us alive. It was what connected us to our bodies, to each other, to the world. Tears ran down my cheeks as I spoke, and I realized I was crying for the first time in months. I understood now. I'd been doing the same thing he was doing, in my own way. I'd been trying to help people by teaching them not to feel too much, not to worry, not to be fully present in their lives. But that wasn't help. That was a kind of death. The room grew gradually warmer, like sunrise slowly melting frost. The oppressive feeling of being watched lifted, replaced by something gentler, more peaceful. The sweet smell of decay began to fade, replaced by familiar antiseptic scent. Robert thanked me, voice already much fainter, more distant, like someone calling from the far end of a tunnel. He remembered now. Being alive was beautiful, even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult. The worry, the awareness, the constant miracle of consciousness. That was the gift, wasn't it? Yes, I whispered into the empty room. It was the most precious gift imaginable. The room fell completely silent, but this time it was a different silence. Not empty or oppressive, but complete and peaceful. When I spoke Robert's name again, no voice answered. Room 237 finally felt truly empty, but in a clean way, like a space that had been properly cleared and blessed. I checked on Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Kim, heart still pounding with awareness of its own rhythm. Both were sleeping peacefully, their monitors showing strong, steady vital signs. Mrs. Patterson's breathing had returned to its natural rhythm, automatic and effortless. Mr. Kim's color was normal, and he stirred when I adjusted his blanket, mumbling about looking forward to going home. Marcus was back to his usual efficiency, moving through rounds with purpose and renewed focus. When I asked about the earlier confusion, He looked genuinely puzzled. The respiratory therapist was making rounds with renewed energy and precision, checking ventilator settings with careful attention to the precious, fragile nature of each breath. The forgetting was over. The spreading confusion about vital status had lifted like fog burning off in morning sunlight. As my shift ended at 7 a.m., I sat in the hospital cafeteria with coffee, watching sunrise paint the windows gold and orange. The coffee was bitter and slightly burned, but I could taste every note, every nuance. I could feel the warmth of the ceramic cup in my hands, hear the familiar chatter of morning shift arriving, smell the mixture of antiseptic and breakfast cooking downstairs. For the first time in years, I was fully present in my own life, completely inhabiting my existence. My heart was beating. I could feel it, steady and strong and necessary. My lungs were working. Each breath felt deliberate and precious. I was alive, completely and undeniably alive, and it was both tremendous responsibility and incredible gift. I pulled out my phone and called my ex-husband David. Not to reconcile, but just to hear a living voice, to connect with someone undeniably, completely, consciously alive. He sounded confused but not unhappy to hear from me at 7 a.m. I told him I was fine. Better than fine. I just wanted to hear his voice, to talk to someone who was alive. He paused, processing this unusual request. I sounded different, he said. More present somehow. Yeah, I said, watching the sun climb higher, feeling its warmth through the window on my face, marveling at the simple miracle of photons traveling 93 million miles to touch my skin. I'm alive, David. Really, truly alive. And I'm going to stay that way. I finished my coffee slowly, savoring each sip, then headed home. But not to hide in an empty apartment, not to collapse into unconscious sleep to avoid thinking about my life. I was going to call my sister, maybe make plans for dinner. I was going to feel things, good and bad, joy and sorrow, connection and loss, because that's what it meant to be alive, to be fully human. And I was never ever going to forget that again.